Somewhere at the bottom of a fissure in the land of shadow, a young woman sleeps forever, holding flowers that will not let her wake, put there deliberately by the golden prince who once swore to protect her. He never went back for her. Somewhere in the ashen wastes of Caled, a rot-scarred swordswoman does not know whether she is a living woman's daughter, her sister, or something with no name in your language at all, only a word borrowed from Japanese that never made it into the English translation. Somewhere beneath a castle, every single player passes through in the opening hours. A corpse's face has been split into a dozen different corpses, scattered across two different continents, still growing, still technically alive, and somewhere underneath all of it sits the very question this channel already answered once and thought it was finished with, because it turns out the god who split herself in two was never the only one. She was simply the first. Tonight we are going looking for every place this world quietly repeats that same trick. Not because the details are the same each time, they are not, but because the pattern is. And once you know what you are looking for, you cannot walk through the lands between again without seeing it everywhere. A god cuts a piece of herself away and calls the piece a stranger. A demigod does the same to his own sister and never speaks of it again. A murdered prince keeps dying in new bodies, scattered across two worlds at once. A princess kills her own body outright, rather than let it be used the way her family's bodies always get used. And at the center of it, a single word this game only uses a handful of times, a word that connects a rot goddess's discarded child to a corpse's scattered faces to the very statue you have already walked past in Leyndell without knowing what it meant. We will answer all of it, not right away and not out of order, because rushing to the end would waste everything that makes the middle worth hearing. Each mystery gets its own room tonight, its own quiet unfolding, before we finally set them down side by side and let you see what they were always spelling out together, one scattered piece after another, gathered at last into a single, coherent shape. You do not have to hold any of this tightly. This is a long, slow telling, built for the kind of night where you would rather listen than think too hard, one mystery unfolding quietly after another. If your eyes close before we reach the far end of it, that is not losing the thread. That is exactly what this was built for. Let your body settle into wherever it is right now. Let the room hold you. There's no need to remember every name tonight introduces, or to hold every thread perfectly in order as it unfolds. No test waiting at the end of any of this. We are going to start with the word itself, because once you have it, you will hear it echo through everything that follows. Chapter 1. The word this world keeps using. There is a term buried in Elden Ring's Japanese text that almost never survives translation, and once you learn it, you cannot stop noticing where it has been hiding. Wakami, split body, a piece of someone else, cut away and set loose into the world as though it were its own separate person. The word surfaces first in an unassuming place, a swordswoman in Caled named Millicent, rot-scarred and searching for a cure that does not exist, uncertain of her own place in the world. Ask her directly what she is, and she gives you an answer that should stop you cold the first time you actually hear it. She says she is of Malenia's blood, but she does not know if that makes her Malenia's child, her little sister, or in her own words, perhaps a Wakami. She is naming a category most players never notice exists, a kind of being this world quietly permits without ever explaining. A person who is simultaneously herself and a fragment of somebody else entirely. The same word appears again, far from Millicent, attached to something considerably stranger. Deep beneath Stormvale Castle, in a basement, most players clear in the game's opening hours without a second thought. A scattering of pale, rooted faces grow from the walls, faces the English text calls Cadaver Surrogates, a clinical distancing phrase that tells you almost nothing. The Japanese calls them wakemi too, the same word used for Millicent's uncertain relationship to Malenia is the exact word attached to something growing out of a dungeon wall, and that repetition is not a coincidence. It is this world quietly telling you that whatever happened to Millicent's bloodline and whatever happened to whoever those rooted faces once belonged to are, on some structural level, the very same kind of event. Notice, too, how carefully this world hides the connection rather than announcing it. Nothing in Millicent's dialogue points you toward Stormvale's basement. Nothing in Stormvale's basement points you toward Kaled. A player could clear both locations entirely, meet both mysteries, and never once suspect they were looking at two branches of the exact same phenomenon, because the only thread connecting them is a single word spoken quietly, easy to miss, in a language most players never think to check against the English translation sitting in front of them. That is worth sitting with on its own before we go any further tonight. This world does not simply hide its secrets behind locked doors, it hides them behind translation itself, trusting that most of its audience will never think to look twice at a language they never learned to read. Here is where tonight's real shape begins to come into view. This world's founding god split herself into two identities, wore two faces, built two families, and lived two entire lives running in parallel for years before anyone said the word Radagon and the word Marika belonged to the very same being. That was not a singular miracle. It was, this channel is going to argue tonight, the first documented instance of something this world's oldest bloodline does constantly, quietly, almost as a reflex. Cut a piece of yourself away, let it walk, call it something else, or call it nothing at all, and never explain why it happened. By the time we reach the end of tonight, you will have met a sister abandoned at the bottom of a fissure, a swordswoman uncertain whether she is a person or a piece, a princess who killed her own body rather than let her family use it, a corpse with more faces than a single body should ever need, and two brothers hidden away specifically so nobody would ever have to look at what their existence proved about the family that produced them. Every single one of them carries some version of that same wake me wound. None of them chose it. All of them were simply born or made or cut loose into a bloodline that treats splitting itself apart as an ordinary, unremarkable way of surviving. Let that word sit with you as we walk. We are going first to understand where this ability actually comes from, because it turns out this family did not invent the trick of dividing themselves. They inherited it from somewhere considerably older than the Golden Order itself. Chapter 2: The Flesh That Melds with Others. Before there was a Golden Order, before there was an Erd tree standing at the center of a golden capital, there were shamans, older peoples whose relationship to flesh, to spirit, and to the boundary between one living thing and another looked nothing like the tidy, singular selfhood the Golden Faith would eventually insist was the only proper way to exist. The clearest surviving trace of that older tradition sits inside an unassuming weapon most players never think to read closely. The tooth whip, an item description scattered across this world's text, tells you plainly that the flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others, a description that sounds, on first read, like poetry, and sounds, on second read, like a direct explanation for everything this entire night has been circling. Marika, by most reasonable readings of the scattered evidence this world provides, carries some inheritance of that older shamanic nature herself, buried beneath the golden performance she and her faith eventually built on top of it. If shamanic flesh genuinely could meld harmoniously with other living things, and if Marika's own body carried some portion of that older capacity, then her ability to become two entirely separate people, Radagon and Marika, sharing one origin but living two full parallel lives, stops looking like an isolated miracle specific to her alone. It starts looking like a specific, deliberate application of a capability her blood may have carried for considerably longer than the Golden Order itself has existed. This reframes everything that follows tonight in a way worth sitting with directly. Every fracture we are about to walk through, Miquella's severance of his own gentleness, Malenia's violent propagation across a battlefield, Godwin's scattering into a dozen rooted faces, Ronnie's decision to abandon her body entirely, may not simply be separate incidents of a family under separate pressures, each finding their own separate way to break. They may all be expressions of the exact same inherited capacity, the same shamanic flesh, still present generations later, surfacing differently depending on what each child needed it for, but drawing from the very same well every single time. There is a question worth sitting with honestly here, rather than rushing past it us toward the more dramatic mysteries still ahead. If this capacity really is inherited, biological, running through Marika's own blood the way this reading suggests, then every one of her children carried it from the moment they were born, whether or not their own individual lives ever gave that capacity a reason to surface. Some of them, Miquella, Malenia, Godwin, eventually found themselves under exactly the kind of pressure that brings this inheritance forward. Others may have lived and died without it ever once activating, the capacity present but never triggered, a wound carried silently and never opened. That possibility matters because it means this family's visible fractures may represent only a portion of everyone who actually carried the capacity to fracture. The rest, whoever they were, simply never faced the specific pressure required to make that inheritance visible, and this world's own surviving texts, focused as they are on the family's most dramatic and most catastrophic members, would have had no particular reason to ever mention them at all. Consider what this means for how you should understand the entire golden performance this family built on top of that older nature. The Golden Order preaches singular, correct, orderly existence, one God, one truth of a one properly bounded self obeying properly bounded laws, and its own founder's flesh, by the oldest surviving description this world offers of what shamans actually were, was never built to stay singular or properly bounded in the first place. Every time one of her children splits, in whatever form that splitting takes, the family's oldest, truest nature is simply reasserting itself over the newer, tadier story everyone agreed to tell about who they actually are. There is a quiet sadness worth naming in this too before we move forward. A capacity that once, in some older shamanic context, may have meant genuine communion, flesh melding harmoniously with other flesh in a way that built connection rather than loss, becomes generations later, inside a family that has forgotten or buried its own origins, something closer to a wound. The melding still happens, the harmony mostly does not. What was once, perhaps, a gift curdles across enough generations of golden performance into something that mostly just means losing pieces of yourself and never quite getting them back. Hold that thought as we walk forward tonight, quietly, the way this world has been holding it the entire time, because every fracture from here on is, in some sense, the same ancient capacity expressed by children who likely never understood where it actually came from. Before we meet the first of them directly, there is a queen worth visiting, because her own fight is the clearest demonstration this world offers of what a mind actually looks like once it has already come apart into pieces. Chapter 3. The Woman Made of Everyone's Memory. Renala's own boss fight does not unfold as a single, continuous battle against one clearly defined body. It unfolds in stages, each one guarded by a different servant wearing an oversized doll-like mask, each mask representing a different fragment of her own court, a different piece of the life she built, and then lost when Radagon walked away from her overnight. To reach the actual grieving woman underneath, you must first fight your way through the fragments she has scattered around herself, as though her own mind had already learned, long before this chapter's central theory ever gave the habit a name, that the safest way to survive an unbearable memory is to break it into smaller, more manageable pieces and let each piece stand guard over a portion of the whole. Consider what this staging actually represents once you have already spent time tonight, learning to notice this pattern everywhere. Renala never physically divides her own body the way Radagon or Miquella eventually will. Her fracturing happens entirely within memory, entirely within the architecture of her own grief, and yet the shape of it is unmistakably the same shape this entire night keeps finding scattered across her family's history. A whole self, unable to bear its own wound directly, breaks into pieces, each piece taking on a portion of the burden the whole could no longer carry intact. The masks themselves deserve a closer look, because they are not simply decorative props. Each one is grotesquely oversized, doll-like, unsettling in a way that suggests these are not simply actors performing a role in Renala's memory, but something closer to constructed vessels, built or repurposed specifically to hold and reenact one fragment of a story, too painful for her to simply remember all at once, in order the way an ordinary memory usually works. There is a reading worth offering here, carefully, because it reaches back to the very shamanic inheritance this chapter has already argued predates the Golden Order entirely. If flesh in this world really can be made to divide, and if that capacity was never limited to Marika's own direct bloodline, then Renala, defeated in a war fought under Radagon's face and married into a family already carrying this exact wound, may have absorbed some portion of that same inherited nature simply through proximity, through marriage, through the sheer duration of years spent close enough to a divided being that some of whatever made that division possible eventually rubbed off on her too. Her grief did not simply feel like fragmentation. It may have become fragmentation, physically, in the same tradition her husband's own family had already been quietly practicing for longer than she ever fully understood. Notice, too, what waits at the very center of all those layered fragments once you finally break through every one of them. Not a monster, and not simply a queen. A moment replayed endlessly, a wedding day that never resolved the way she needed it to, held perfectly, unbearably intact at the heart of a mind that has scattered every less essential memory around it, layer after layer, purely to protect that one fragment from ever having to change. Rest here a moment longer, quietly, before we continue onward. We are going to the fissure now, to meet the sister nobody ever went back for. Chapter 4. The Sister Left at the Bottom of the World. Far beneath the land of shadow, past a drop most players approach cautiously, and a fair number avoid entirely, a young woman lies asleep in a small stone chamber, undisturbed, holding a scattering of pale flowers that keep her that way permanently. Her name is Saint Trina, and by the time you find her, she has almost certainly already been mentioned to you elsewhere, spoken of with real tenderness by people who clearly cared for her, and yet nobody in this story ever explains who actually put her here, or why nobody with the power to save her ever came back to try. The flowers are the first genuine mystery worth sitting with. Saint Trina's tears, gathered from blooms like the ones cradled in her own sleeping hands, are famous throughout this world for a single, consistent effect. They induce deep, dreamless sleep in anyone who encounters them, an effect useful enough that other characters actively seek the flowers out, weaponize them, even build entire schemes around them. The saint associated with unbreakable sleep is herself unbreakably asleep, at the very bottom of a fissure most travelers never think to explore, and the flowers surrounding her are not simply thematic set dressing. They appear to be, in some sense, that this world never explains directly hers. Thiolier, a scholar who has spent considerable effort investigating St. Trina specifically, eventually arrives at a conclusion that reframes everything you thought you understood about her. St. Trina, he suggests, was never a separate saint who happened to share a spiritual theme with Miquella, Golden Prince of Gentleness and Compassion. She was a piece of Miquella himself, split away and set apart, carrying a quality of him he could not afford to keep. Sit with what that actually means before moving forward, because it deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. Miquella is remembered by every faction that speaks of him as endlessly kind, endlessly patient, a healer whose gentleness verges on the miraculous. And yet, Miquella's own path toward godhood, the ambition that drives every major decision he makes across this entire story, requires him to become something considerably harder than gentle. It requires manipulation on a scale that binds entire armies to his will without their consent. It requires abandoning his own sister to a war she did not choose. It requires, in the end, becoming exactly the kind of ruthless architect a golden prince known purely for kindness should never be capable of becoming. Perhaps that is precisely why Trina exists apart from him. Perhaps Miquella, sensing what his own ambition was going to cost him, made a choice long before any of the DLC's events that his mother had already made once herself, drawing, whether he understood it or not, on that same shamanic capacity for flesh to divide and still keep living in two places as two different weights carried by two different names. He kept the gentleness that would only ever slow him down, and instead of losing it entirely, he cut it loose, gave it a name, gave it a resting place, and left it sleeping at the bottom of a fissure, so far from anywhere important that almost nobody would ever think to go looking for it. That is the shape of the first real payoff tonight has for you. Miquella did not simply become ruthless over the course of his story. He appears to have deliberately amputated the part of himself that could not survive what he was planning to become, and then having done it, never went back to check on what he had left behind. Rest here a moment if you need to. There is more to this particular abandonment than the flowers alone can tell you. Chapter 5: What Miquella Cut Away to Become a God. Return to St. Trina's chamber once more, because there is a second detail worth sitting with, easy to miss on a first visit. She is not simply asleep. She is, by every reading the game supports, dreaming, caught inside some private interior world. The flowers around her sustain indefinitely, undisturbed by the passage of actual time. Whatever she experiences down there, whatever she believes is happening to her while she sleeps, it is not simply blankness, it is a life, running somewhere Miquella himself is not present to witness it. This detail matters, because it tells you something about what Miquella actually did when he split himself, rather than simply that he did it. He did not destroy the gentler half of himself. He preserved it carefully, deliberately, in conditions specifically designed to keep it safe and undisturbed for as long as necessary. That is not the behavior of someone discarding a weakness in disgust. It is the behavior of someone who loved the thing he was giving up enough to build it a resting place rather than simply erase it. Compare that tenderness to what the rest of Miquella's story actually requires of him. His entire late game arc is built around securing followers through compulsion rather than consent, the golden thread of his Empyrean flame, binding warriors and gods alike to a devotion they never fully agreed to. Even his own closest allies, Mohg most catastrophically, end up serving purposes Miquella designed for them rather than purposes they chose for themselves. A being still carrying the full weight of Trina's compassion could likely never have built that structure. Manipulating an entire world into loving you, however gently packaged, requires a kind of calculated distance, ordinary compassion tends to resist. So Miquella built himself a workaround. Keep the compassion, but keep it separate, sealed away somewhere it could not interfere with the ambition running the rest of him. It is worth noticing how closely this mirrors what we already understand about his own mother's divided existence. Marika, too, appears to have needed a version of herself capable of things her original nature would not have easily permitted. A general's ruthlessness she could not access while remaining fully only herself. She solved that problem by becoming two people. Her son, generations later, appears to have solved a nearly identical problem by cutting one specific piece of himself away and leaving it somewhere safe rather than integrating it into the person he actually needed to become. There is a further detail worth sitting with here, too, one that only becomes visible once you already understand the shamanic inheritance running underneath this family's entire bloodline. If flesh that melds harmoniously with others can also, under the right pressures, be made to divide, then what Miquella performed on himself was never simply symbolic. He may have genuinely, physically, split a working, feeling piece of his own nature away from the rest of him, using an inherited capacity his mother had already demonstrated on a considerably larger scale. Trina is not a metaphor for Miquella's lost gentleness. She may, quite literally, be it. There is a difference worth naming, though, before we move on, because it matters for how the rest of tonight is going to unfold. Marika's split cost an entire family everything, decades of abandonment, radiating outward into wars and rebellions across 2 generations. Miquella's split, at least so far as the evidence shows us, cost mainly Trina herself, alone, asleep, unable to consent to a separation made entirely on her behalf. Whether that makes his version more forgivable or simply quieter is a question worth carrying forward rather than answering right now, because we are about to meet someone who inherited this exact same wound from the other side of Miquella's family, and her version of it looks nothing like sleep at all. Come back to the sound of my voice for a moment. We are leaving the fissure now, traveling toward a battlefield where a second sibling learned to split herself apart in a considerably more violent way. Chapter 6: The Bloom That Would Not Stay One Person. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, twin sister to the Golden Prince, whose gentleness now sleeps in a fissure far beneath the land of shadow, carries her own version of this family's central wound, and unlike her brother's quiet, careful separation, hers arrived on a battlefield in front of witnesses at a scale nobody could ever have hidden afterward. The Battle of Aeonia pitted Malenia against General Radon, the single strongest warrior the lands between had ever produced, a demigod capable of physically arresting the movement of the stars. To win that fight, or at minimum to survive it, Malenia unleashed the full extent of her own affliction, a scarlet rot she carries not merely as a disease, but as an active, devastating weapon, remembered ever after specifically as her greatest rot. Radon survived that battle, though barely, and paid for it with a slow, unnatural decay that would define the rest of his existence. Malenia survived it too, but something about what she unleashed that day did not simply disperse once the fighting ended. The rot she released across that battlefield appears to have propagated, spreading, and taking root in ways an ordinary weapon never could, and it is widely understood across this world's surviving fragments of lore that this same catastrophic bloom is the origin point of an entire scattered lineage, Millicent and her sisters among them, born or grown from whatever Malenia's rot left behind on that ruined field. Malenia did not simply fight a war that day. She appears to have, quite literally, propagated pieces of herself outward into the world without ever choosing to, without ever being asked. This is worth holding up directly against her brother's version of the same wound. Miquella split himself carefully, deliberately, preserving what he cut away in conditions built specifically to protect it. Malenia's splitting happened as collateral damage in the middle of the single, most violent moment of her entire life, uncontrolled, unintended, scattering pieces of herself across a battlefield the way shrapnel scatters from an explosion. Neither sibling asked for the family's inherited pattern. Both of them enacted it anyway, in registers as different from each other as war is from sleep. Notice, too, what this suggests about the shamanic inheritance we spent the last chapter tracing. If Marika's flesh, and by extension her children's flesh, genuinely carries a capacity to meld and divide that predates the Golden Order entirely, then that capacity does not appear to require calm, controlled circumstances to activate. It can surface under duress, under mortal threat, in the middle of the worst moment of someone's entire life, without their consent and without their understanding of what is actually happening to them as it happens. Malenia did not choose the rot's greatest bloom the way Miquella chose Trina's resting place. Her body simply did under pressure what this family's bodies apparently know how to do. There is a version of this story where Malenia's scattered offshoots simply read as a strange side effect of a powerful weapon, nothing more meaningful than that. But once you have already watched her brother sever Saint Trina and preserve her with obvious tenderness, once you already understand what their own parent did generations earlier by becoming two people rather than one, Malenia's rot propagating into new, separate, uncertain lives reads considerably less like an accident and considerably more like inheritance expressing itself the only way it knew how in the middle of a war she could not otherwise survive. Let that settle for a moment. We are about to meet one of the people who came out of that battlefield, still not entirely sure what she actually is. Chapter 7: The Sister Who Doesn't Know What She Is. Millicent wanders Caelid's ruined stretches, searching for a cure to an affliction that has no cure, rot-scarred, capable, and genuinely uncertain about her own place in this world, in a way almost no other character in the entire game is permitted to be. She knows her blood traces back to Malenia. She does not know what that fact is actually supposed to mean about who she is. Her own words on the subject, spoken plainly if you follow her story far enough, name the uncertainty directly rather than letting the player simply infer it. She might be Malenia's child, she might be her little sister, or she might be, and here the game finally hands you the exact word this entire chapter has been circling. Awake me, a split body, a fragment of somebody else wearing her own separate name and living her own separate life without ever fully belonging to either category cleanly. That uncertainty is worth sitting inside rather than rushing past, because it is doing something genuinely unusual for a character in this world. Most figures in the lands between know precisely what they are, even when what they are is tragic. Millicent does not get that clarity. She was grown, or born, or spun off from the aftermath of a battle that scattered her origin across an entire field, and nobody, not the game, not any surrounding character, not Millicent herself, is ever able to tell you with full confidence which of those three categories actually applies to her. Her physical decline across her own quest line deserves to be named directly here too, because it complicates any easy reading of her as simply a fortunate survivor of her mother's rot. The rot does not spare her the way it spared, for a time, Malenia herself. It consumes her, visibly, across the course of her story, one of the few characters in this entire world permitted to physically deteriorate in front of the player rather than simply existing in a single fixed state from introduction to farewell. Whatever Millicent is, Wakami or daughter or sister, her body pays the family's price for it regardless. The same rot, the same slow unmaking, inherited along with everything else she never asked for. Her story ends, depending on the choices a player makes, in one of a small handful of paths, but the path most worth naming here involves her sisters, Other offshoots scattered from that same catastrophic bloom, gathering together, finding each other, choosing in the end to blossom fully into the rot they were born carrying rather than continuing to fight it. There is something quietly devastating in that choice. A group of split off pieces of a larger, more famous woman finally deciding that if they were never going to be permitted a clean, singular identity of their own, they would at least choose together how their shared fragment of a life was going to end. Notice, before we move on, how precisely this answers one of the questions posed at the very start of tonight. Millicent does not know whether she is a daughter, a sister, or a Wakami, because this world genuinely does not have a clean category for what Malenia's family keeps producing. Not gods, not quite people, not quite anything with a name that fully fits. Just pieces set loose, left to work out for themselves what a fragment of somebody else is actually supposed to become. Rest here if you need to. We are turning now toward a sister who looked at this entire family pattern clearly enough to choose something no one else in this story ever dared to choose instead. Chapter 8: The Daughter Who Chose to Leave Her Body Behind. Every fracture tonight has walked through so far shares one quality in common. A piece gets separated, and the original self continues on, carrying the loss forward, whether tenderly, as with Miquella, or violently, as with Malenia. Rani, daughter of Renala, and the same divided being we know as Radagon, and Marika both, chose something considerably stranger and considerably more deliberate than either of her half-siblings ever attempted. Rani did not cut a piece of herself away and let the rest of her continue on as before. She killed her own physical body outright, deliberately, as a young princess, and moved what remained of herself, her spirit, her intent, her considerable and patient will, into a small, doll-like vessel instead, small enough to be carried, fragile enough to require a companion's protection, and entirely disconnected from the flesh she was actually born into. Where Miquella preserved the piece he cut away, and Malenia scattered pieces she never meant to lose, Rani looked at her own body, understood exactly what her family, and the Golden Order behind it, intended to use that body for, and chose to destroy the whole of it, rather than let any part of that plan proceed. Consider what she was actually escaping, because the choice only makes full sense once you understand the stakes. As an Empyrean in her own right, Rani's original body carried the same potential Marika's once did, the potential to be claimed, elevated, and bound permanently into service of the Golden Order's ongoing structure, a fate that had already, by the time of her birth, cost her own mother decades of frozen grief and cost her own father, wearing Radagon's face, whatever remained of his ability to simply exist as one whole person. Rani watched that fate consume the family around her, and rather than wait to see which piece of herself she might eventually be forced to cut away in order to survive it, the way her half-siblings would each eventually be forced to, she removed herself from the equation entirely, killing the vessel the Golden Order would have needed in order to claim her. This reframes her small, doll-like form, easy for a first-time player to dismiss as simply a strange character design choice, into something considerably more purposeful. It is not a diminishment. It is a deliberate, chosen container, small enough to be protected, small enough to be hidden, entirely unlike the golden, visible, claimable bodies the rest of her family kept being forced to sacrifice pieces of. Where Marika needed 2 full bodies to survive the demands placed on her, Rani discovered that the safest body was the smallest one, the one nobody would think to look at twice, the one built specifically to carry a mind and nothing else. Hold this up against everything tonight has already shown you, because the contrast matters. Miquella's severance served his own ambition, a calculated cost paid in exchange for the ruthlessness godhood required of him. Malenia's scattering served nothing at all, an uncontrolled consequence of surviving a war she could not otherwise have won. Rani's choice, alone among every fracture tonight has walked through, appears to have served neither ambition nor mere survival, but something closer to escape, a considered, patient rejection of the entire inheritance the rest of her family kept accepting generation after generation, without ever once trying to simply walk away from it instead. She did not, in the end, entirely succeed at leaving the family pattern behind either. Her eventual path toward the Age of Stars still requires binding herself to a tarnished consort, still requires claiming godhood through means the Golden Order itself would recognize as legitimate, still requires, in its own way, a kind of division, a self reduced to something smaller and more distant than what she once was, ruling from a careful remove rather than close at hand. But she remains, of every child born to this fractured family, the only one who looked directly at the wound running through her own blood and tried deliberately to cut herself free of the entire structure that kept causing it, rather than simply enduring one more variation of the same old cost. Consider, too, what her companions along the way suggest about how she chose to survive the years this plan actually required. Bled, a wolf-shaped man raised at her own side, and Iji, a war counselor built by considerably stranger means than ordinary birth, both serve her with a loyalty that reads less like employment and more like family, assembled deliberately rather than inherited by blood. Where the rest of Marika's children were left to navigate this world's cruelty largely alone, Rani appears to have understood early and acted on the understanding that surviving her own family's wound might require building a second, chosen family around herself, one she selected rather than one that was simply handed to her by circumstance. That is its own quiet answer to everything this family's original wound cost everyone else tonight has already walked through. Where they lost pieces of themselves and were left to grieve those losses alone, Rani gathered pieces of a life around herself instead, deliberately, patiently, refusing to let her own isolation become one more inherited cost she simply had to accept without a fight. Come back to the sound of my voice for a moment. We are turning now toward the sibling whose splitting happened first of all, and considerably more violently than anything we have walked through so far tonight. Chapter 9: A Death with Too Many Faces. Godwyn the Golden, eldest of Marika's children, beloved heir the Golden Order, treated as living proof of its own legitimacy, was killed on a single night, remembered ever after as the Night of the Black Knives, murdered in his own bed by assassins carrying a weapon built for exactly one purpose: severing a person from the grace that was supposed to make death impossible for someone like him. That death should never have been possible at all. Demigods in this world carry a portion of Marika's own grace, a protection meant to place true death permanently out of their reach. The Black Knife exists specifically to cut through that protection, and on that single night it succeeded, tearing a hole not simply in Godwyn's life, but in the very rules this world relies on to keep its most important figures safe. What followed was not a clean death. Godwyn did not simply pass on the way an ordinary person might. He fractured instead his body and whatever remains of his consciousness, scattering outward across this world in pieces, neither fully alive nor fully permitted the mercy of being fully gone. His upper remains become entangled with the Erd tree itself, folded into the very avatars that patrol Landal's grounds. Other fragments of him surface far from the capital entirely, in places that should have no connection to a murdered golden prince at all. This fracturing is the clearest, largest scale version of tonight's central pattern that this world has to offer, and it happened before either of his younger half-siblings ever split themselves in their own smaller, more deliberate ways, and before his half-sister Rani ever chose to destroy her own body rather than let it be claimed. Godwyn did not choose his splitting. It was inflicted on him, violently, in a single night, by assassins who could not have known they were establishing a shape His entire family would keep repeating for generations afterward, some by choice, some by accident, none of them ever quite finishing what that first assassination started. Consider, too, what Godwin's death actually cost the specific idea he had spent his entire life embodying. He was not simply a beloved son, he was proof, walking and breathing proof, that the Golden Order's promise of inherited grace could pass cleanly from mother to child, untroubled, unbroken, exactly the way the faith's own teaching insisted it always would. His murder did not simply end one life, it ended the clearest evidence the Golden Faith had ever produced that its own central promise actually worked the way it claimed to. And it is worth wondering whether the scattering that followed his death was not simply a physical consequence of the Black Knife's own strange properties, but something closer to a symbolic collapse made literal, the Golden Faith's cleanest proof of legitimacy breaking apart into exactly the kind of scattered, uncertain pieces the rest of this family's history had already been quietly producing all along, whether anyone back in the capital wanted to admit the resemblance or not. There is a detail worth sitting with here that connects directly back to the shamanic inheritance we traced earlier in the night. If Marika's own flesh carried a capacity to divide that predates the Golden Order, and if that capacity can, as Malenia's case already suggested, activate involuntarily under sufficient violence, then Godwin's fracturing may not simply be a magical side effect of the Black Knife's particular properties. It may be his own inherited nature responding to catastrophic injury, the only way this family's bodies apparently know how to respond, dividing rather than simply ending, scattering rather than simply dying, because whatever built this bloodline never gave any of its members a version of death that stays contained to just one body, in just one place, all at once. Let that stillness settle before we go looking for exactly where the pieces of him actually ended up. Chapter 10: The Cadaver Surrogates. Return now to that basement beneath Stormvale Castle, the one nearly every player clears in their very first hours in this world, long before they have any reason to suspect what they are actually looking at. Pale, rooted faces grow directly from the dungeon walls there, unsettling in a way the game never fully explains in the moment, simply left for you to notice, or not, and move past. These are Godwin's remains, or more precisely, they are what the English text calls cadaver surrogates, faces split away from his original body and rooted into new locations, entirely independent of wherever the rest of him ended up. The Japanese text, as we have already established, calls them wakemi, split bodies. The exact same term Millicent uses to describe her own uncertain relationship to Malenia, now applied directly to Godwin's scattered remains, confirming without any ambiguity left that these two situations, a living swordswoman uncertain of her own origin and a dead prince's face rooted into a dungeon wall, belong to precisely the same category of phenomenon in this world's own internal logic. The Land of Shadow contains its own scattering of these same faces, found in locations far from Stormvale, far from Lendel, far from anywhere directly connected to Godwin's original death. His fracturing did not stay contained to a single continent. Whatever force scattered him kept scattering him across an expansion's worth of new geography, years after the assassination that first tore him open. There is a particular horror worth naming in how ordinary these faces have become to the world around them by the time you actually encounter them. Nobody guards Stormvale's basement the way you might expect a scattered god's remains to be guarded. Nobody has built a shrine or attempted a rescue, or even, so far as any surviving text suggests, tried especially hard to gather the pieces back together. They simply grow there, rooted and quiet, treated by this world's remaining inhabitants as background rather than tragedy, the way a wound eventually stops hurting simply because everyone around it has had enough time to stop looking at it directly. Consider what this means when held up against everything else tonight has already shown you. Marika chose her own splitting, however costly it eventually became. Miquella chose his, carefully, tenderly, preserving what he cut away. Malenia's happened as violent, uncontrolled collateral damage in the middle of a war she had no choice but to fight. Ronnie chose to destroy her own body rather than let this family's pattern claim it. Godwin's happened to him entirely, inflicted by outside violence on a single catastrophic night, and then it simply kept happening indefinitely, his remains still scattering into new pieces, years and continents removed from the moment his death first began. This family did not invent the Wakami wound with Marika's own choice to become two people. Godwin's death suggests something considerably bleaker. It suggests that splitting apart under enough pressure may simply be what happens to beings built the way this family is built, whether they choose it, whether they preserve it tenderly, whether they even survive the moment it happens to them at all. Come back to the sound of my voice for a moment. Before we go underground to meet the two brothers, this family tried hardest to make sure nobody ever had to look at. There is a girl who walks beside every tarnished for most of this entire story, and who may belong on tonight's list more directly than anyone has ever fully said out loud. Chapter 11: The Third Child. Nobody counts. Malenia appears at a campfire early in your journey, offers herself as your maiden, feeds you runes drawn from the strength of everyone you defeat, and eventually offers to become the flame that finally burns the Erd tree down. She names no mother, no father, no home. She simply arrives already bound to a purpose she did not choose for herself, carrying knowledge about this world's deepest workings that an ordinary traveler has no obvious way of possessing. Notice how closely that shape matches everything tonight has already traced. A figure with no documented origin, already devoted to a function before the story properly introduces her, is exactly the shape Radagon himself took when he first appeared leading armies into Liurnia. That resemblance alone does not prove anything. This world is careful, consistently, never to confirm a single clean answer about what Malenia actually is, and it is worth being honest about how far the evidence genuinely goes rather than simply declaring the mystery solved. What the evidence does offer are threads worth naming plainly. Malenia's entire purpose ties directly to fire, to the burning of the Erd tree itself, an act that only makes sense if whoever carries it out holds some deep, structural connection to the very tree she is meant to destroy. Some readers understand her as a seedling grown specifically for this purpose, cultivated the way other maidens in this world are cultivated, meant to serve a dying tarnished until the moment her own service ends. Others, following a thinner but persistent thread through this world's more obscure text, wonder whether she carries a more direct connection to Marika's own bloodline, a hidden daughter shaped for a single purpose and never told anything else about who she might otherwise have been. Hold that second reading up against everything tonight has already gathered, because if it holds any water at all, it repeats the pattern with an exactness that should genuinely unsettle you. A being with no clear origin, quietly serving a function larger than herself, never given the chance to exist as anyone outside of that function, walking beside you for the length of an entire story without ever once being permitted, or perhaps without ever once choosing, to explain who she actually is underneath the role. That is not simply Miquella's severed gentleness, or Malenia's scattered rot, or Godwin's rooted faces. It is the same shape again, worn by someone who spends more hours in your company than almost anyone else in this entire world, and who most players never once suspect might belong on this list at all. There is a detail worth sitting with in how her own story eventually resolves, too. When the moment finally comes for her to become the flame that burns the Erd tree, the game frames it carefully as her own decision, offered to you rather than simply imposed on you, one of the only instances in this entire family's history where someone builds for a single purpose is at least shown appearing to choose that purpose herself, out loud, in words you are present to hear. Whether that framing represents genuine consent or simply the most convincing performance of consent this family has ever produced is a question this world leaves entirely in your hands, and it is worth noticing how rarely anyone else in tonight's telling was ever given even that much of a choice to perform. This one, more than almost any other mystery tonight has walked through, deserves to stay genuinely open. The game does not want you certain here, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. What can be said is only this: if this family had a habit of producing beings built to serve a purpose, rather than people permitted to simply exist, Melina fits that habit disturbingly well, whether or not she was ever actually born into it at all. And come back to the sound of my voice for a moment. We are going underground now to meet the two brothers this family tried hardest to make sure nobody ever had to look at. Chapter 12. Two Brothers the Order was Ashamed of. Beneath Landel's golden streets, close enough to the capital that the distance is almost an insult, an entire second city exists in the dark, home to the diseased, the outcast, and the deliberately forgotten. Somewhere inside that buried world, two brothers were born to golden parents and immediately hidden away, marked by a curse the Golden Order treats as proof of impurity rather than the divine inheritance it may actually represent. Mohg and Morgott, twin sons born Omen, cursed with horns and a monstrous secondary form, the faith that produced them refuses to acknowledge as legitimate, despite being every bit as much the children of gods as their golden brother Godwin ever was. Their existence alone is a quiet scandal the Golden Order never had to answer for publicly, because it simply made sure the two of them were never seen. The brothers' paths diverge sharply from there, and that divergence matters as much as the shared curse that started them both in the same place. Morgott chooses, or perhaps simply resigns himself, to defend the very capital that has never once fully accepted him, holding Landell together through catastrophe after catastrophe out of what reads as genuine, exhausted duty to a family that barely acknowledged his existence while they were still alive to do so. He rules in secret as the Omen King while presenting himself publicly under a different, more acceptable name, an entire second identity built specifically to let him serve the capital without ever forcing that capital to look directly at what he actually is. Mohg chooses something considerably more radical, disappearing into the underground his curse condemned him to, and beginning, slowly, patiently, to build something entirely his own down there, on terms nobody golden ever offered him. Notice, before we go further, how precisely this splits along a pattern tonight has already shown you several times now. One sibling stays and defends the broken structure he was never fully welcomed into, going so far as to divide his own public identity in order to keep doing it. Another sibling leaves it behind entirely and tries to build something new in its place. Miquella and Malenia never got the chance to make that same choice about their own splitting, because their splitting happened to pieces of themselves rather than to their whole selves choosing different paths. Ranni made her choice by destroying her body outright. Mohg and Morgott, whole people from the start, cursed but never divided the way their younger siblings would eventually be, got to choose their relationship to the family's central wound directly, and even given that full choice, one of them still chose loyalty to an order that despised him, hiding behind a second name to make that loyalty possible, and the other chose exile and reinvention instead. There is a deeper thread hiding underneath their curse itself, though, one that neither brother's individual choice fully explains, and it is worth pulling on directly before we understand what Mohg eventually does with the life he built in the dark. Before that, it is worth walking through the buried city itself, because Mohg and Morgott were never actually alone down there. Rest here for a moment. We are going deeper first, into the city built beneath the city, to meet everyone else this family's wound produced. Chapter 13: The City Built to Hold Everyone Else. Directly beneath Lanedel's own golden streets, close enough that the two cities practically share a foundation, the subterranean shunning grounds hold everyone this world's golden faith decided it would rather not look at. The diseased, the deformed, the cursed, gathered together in the darks by an order that preferred burying its unwanted rather than caring for them properly in the light. Mohg and Morgott's own origins trace back to this exact space, but they were never its only residence. The Dung Eater rules a portion of this buried world with an ambition considerably darker than mere survival, dreaming openly of using the capital's own honored dead, the very bodies the Golden Order promises will be gathered peacefully back into the Erd Tree as raw material for a curse of his own design, one meant to punish the very faith that condemned him to these tunnels in the first place. His presence here matters for tonight's purposes, not because his own story involves splitting himself the way the Golden family upstairs keeps splitting itself, but because it reveals what happens to an ordinary person with no divine blood at all, left to marinate for years in a space built entirely around this family's own discarded wound. He absorbed the shape of it anyway. Ambition curdled into a plan built around repurposing bodies for a darker end, the same basic structure this entire telling keeps finding, expressed now by someone with no golden blood in him whatsoever. Consider what it means that a golden capital, gleaming and orderly at street level, sits directly on top of a space this crowded, this thoroughly a monument to the faith's own unacknowledged cruelty. Every named figure tonight has already walked through, Mohg and Morgott included, had at least a claim to divine blood, however unwelcome that blood eventually made them. The Dung Eater has no such claim. He is simply an ordinary man, shaped by an ordinary life, spent trapped beneath a golden order that never once considered him worth acknowledging, and his own eventual descent into exactly the kind of body repurposing violence this family's golden children keep practicing suggests the wound running through tonight's entire telling was never strictly confined to Marika's own bloodline. It was available apparently to anyone spending long enough trapped inside the shape of this world's cruelty, regardless of what blood happened to be running through them when they arrived. There is a bleaker symmetry worth sitting with here, too. The golden capital above promises its faithful dead a peaceful return to the Erd Tree, absorbed gently, honored, gathered back into something larger than themselves. The shunning grounds below offer a considerably darker mirror of that exact same promise. Bodies gathered, absorbed, and repurposed, except here the gathering serves vengeance rather than devotion. Same basic shape, entirely different destination, and the Golden Capital's own citizens, walking the streets directly above, likely never once suspected how closely their own faith's central promise was already being echoed and perverted in the dark just beneath their feet. Chapter 14: Morgott's Two Names. Every player who has ever played this game has met Morgott, the fell Omen, blocking the road to Stormvale Castle in the opening hours. A vicious, cunning opponent, memorable enough that his warning, spoken before the fight even begins, has become one of the most quoted lines to come out of this entire game. Far fewer players, on a first playthrough, ever learn that Morgott and Morgott, the Omen King who rules in secret beneath Landel, and eventually stands between the player and the capital's throne room, are the very same person. Sit with that structure for a moment, because it deserves more attention than most players ever give it. Morgott does not simply hide his Omen nature, the way an ordinary person might hide a private shame. He builds an entire second identity around it, a separate name, a separate role, a separate presence in the world, deployed specifically so that his public function, guarding the roads near Stormvale, intercepting travelers before they ever reach anywhere important, can be performed without anyone connecting that guardian back to the king who actually rules beneath the Golden Capital's own streets. This is not simply a disguise in the ordinary sense. Morgott is not Morgott wearing a mask that could be removed to reveal the truth underneath. Morgott functions as a genuinely separate operational identity, encountered, fought, and remembered by an enormous portion of this game's audience as his own distinct figure, long before most of those same players ever learn the two names describe one single Omen king. That is, in miniature, precisely the same structure Radagon and Marika built, at a considerably larger scale, one being two names, two separate public functions, each identity doing work the other one could not do while remaining undetected as the very same person underneath. Notice what each half of Morgott's divided identity actually accomplishes, because the division is not arbitrary. Morgott polices the roads and the approach to Stormvale, a role requiring visible, active confrontation with outsiders, precisely the kind of exposure a king hiding an entire secret capital could never risk performing under his real name. Morgott, meanwhile, rules from concealment, defending Lanedel's throne room itself, a role requiring permanence and legitimacy that a wandering, unnamed omen blocking a country road could never convincingly claim. Neither identity could do the other's job. Splitting himself in two, in this specific and deliberate way, may be the very thing that let Morgott hold his position at all, hidden in plain sight at the edges of the map and secretly enthroned at its very center, all at once. There is a quiet sorrow worth naming in how ordinary this arrangement has clearly become to him by the time you actually meet either half of it. He does not perform the split as though it were some rare, desperate measure adopted only for this one specific purpose. He performs it, this world strongly suggests, as an established, ongoing practice, one identity built to absorb danger and confrontation, the other kept protected, hidden, and functioning at the center of everything that actually matters to him. Whatever this family inherited from Marika's own oldest shamanic nature, Morgott appears to have learned, somewhere along the way, exactly how to put it to disciplined, practical use, the way you might learn to live comfortably inside an old, familiar wound rather than ever fully healing it. Consider what it took to sustain that practice across however many years passed between Morgott's own cursed birth and the moment you finally meet either half of him. Radagon and Marika needed decades to build their own two lives into something sustainable, and even then, the strain of maintaining both eventually exhausted every part of the being underneath. Morgott appears to have managed something similar, with considerably less time and considerably less divine power to draw on, an Omen king running two full identities on the strength of discipline alone, rather than any inherited capacity for genuinely splitting his own flesh the way his golden parent once did. That distinction matters. Where Radagon and Marika's division was, this telling has already argued, something closer to a literal, physical capacity. Morgott's own version may simply be performance, extraordinarily sustained, extraordinarily convincing performance, but performance nonetheless, a mortal Omen doing through sheer will what his own golden family accomplished through inherited ancient nature. If that reading holds, it makes his own achievement, in its own strange way, even more remarkable than his parents', a man with no shamanic inheritance at all, teaching himself to live two full lives anyway, simply because two full lives were what his own survival required of him. Come back to the sound of my voice for a moment. We are going to look now at the deeper thread hiding underneath both brothers' curse, the one that finally explains where their divided nature actually comes from. Chapter 15, The Blood Underneath the Golden Blood. The Omen curse that marked Mohg and Morgott from birth is treated by every official voice inside the Golden Order's own faith as a mark of impurity, evidence that something went wrong in the blood rather than evidence of anything worth understanding more deeply. But look closely at what the curse actually produces physically, and a different reading starts to surface, one this world never states outright, but leaves scattered across enough suggestive detail to take seriously. Omens carry horns. Omens carry a secondary, monstrous true form hidden beneath their more human seeming exterior. And somewhere underneath this world's oldest layers of belief, older than the Golden Order, older even than Marika's own arrival, other horned and monstrous figures already existed, tied to older, stranger divinities. The Golden Faith spent generations working to suppress, absorb, or simply write out of its official account of the world entirely. The fell god, whose blood and whose curse the Golden Faith treats as something to be diluted and hidden rather than honored, sits somewhere near the root of that older buried tradition. Consider the possibility, offered carefully rather than as settled fact, that the Omen curse is not simply a random genetic misfortune, striking unlucky members of an otherwise golden bloodline. Consider instead that it may be this bloodline's own oldest inheritance surfacing, a strain of considerably older, considerably less orderly divine blood the Golden Order has spent its entire existence trying to bury beneath a newer, tidier story about who this family actually is. Every time an Omen is born, on this reading, the family's real older nature briefly breaks back through the golden performance layered on top of it, the very same shamanic boundary crossing nature we traced two brothers earlier back to Marika's own flesh. That would explain a detail worth sitting with directly. Mohg and Morgott are not treated by the story as strangers who somehow infiltrated a golden family. They are treated as an embarrassment, hidden rather than exiled outright, kept close enough to still serve the family's purposes while being denied any acknowledgement of what their existence actually proves. You do not typically hide something you consider a foreign contamination quite this carefully. You hide something you recognize, uncomfortably, as belonging to you. If that reading holds any weight at all, then Mohg and Morgott's curse becomes considerably more than simple misfortune. It becomes the clearest surviving evidence that this family's golden surface was never the whole truth, was perhaps never even the deeper truth, just the version everyone eventually agreed to perform loudly enough that the older blood underneath got treated as an embarrassing exception rather than what it may actually have been all along. Notice, too, how this reframes the very geography of Landell itself. A golden capital, gleaming and orderly at street level, built directly on top of a hidden second city populated by exactly the kind of cursed, buried blood the surface city refuses to acknowledge. That is not simply a coincidence of level design. It is, read against everything tonight has argued, the clearest physical map of this family's own internal structure that the game ever offers you, a golden performance built directly over top the older, buried thing it was always secretly resting on, close enough that you could walk from one to the other in minutes, and yet far enough in every way that actually matters that an entire capital's worth of golden citizens could live and die without ever looking down. Let that sit uneasily for a moment. We are about to watch what happens when one of these two brothers decides that older, buried blood is exactly what his own ambitions require. Chapter 16: Why It Had to Be Mohg. Mohg's ambitions, once he has fully carved out his hidden kingdom beneath Landell, center on a plan considerably stranger and considerably more disturbing than simple rebellion against the family that abandoned him. He seeks to found an entirely new bloodline, a new Lord of Blood dynasty answering to him alone, and the vessel he chooses to make that dynasty possible is his own half-brother, Miquella, kidnapped and bound to Mohg's own blood through ritual, intended to be reborn as something Mohg alone will father and rule over completely. The obvious question worth asking is why Miquella specifically, and the game gives you enough scattered explanation to understand the surface answer. Miquella's own Empyrean nature, his own potential claim to godhood, makes him uniquely valuable as a vessel for exactly the kind of new dynasty Mohg is attempting to found. But there is a second, quieter question worth asking underneath that first one, and tonight's whole pattern finally gives you the tools to actually answer it. Why did this need to happen through Mohg, an Omen specifically, rather than through any other demigod capable of forcing the same ritual? Return to the theory we just sat with, that the Omen curse may represent this family's own older, buried blood surfacing, rather than a random impurity striking from outside. If that reading holds, then Mohg is not simply a desperate hidden son improvising a plan out of pure resentment. He may be, without ever fully understanding it himself, the one member of this entire golden family whose own blood still carries enough of that older, unhidden divinity to actually complete a ritual this ambitious, precisely because he was never permitted to bury his own nature the way his golden siblings were. Miquella needed an Omen's blood specifically on this reading, not because any convenient vessel would do, but because founding something genuinely new required blood that had never fully submitted to the golden performance the rest of the family spent generations perfecting. Mohg's curse, treated his entire life as a source of shame, becomes in this one specific and devastating moment the single rarest resource left anywhere in the lands between. There is a bitter irony worth sitting with before we move past this. The very blood the Golden Order spent Mohg's entire existence hiding, denying, and treating as an embarrassment turns out to be the one thing powerful enough to make his half-brother's plan for godhood actually possible. Everything this family buried about itself for generations comes due at once in a stolen ritual performed in the dark by the one son the golden light was never willing to look at directly. And it is worth noting once more the shape of what actually happens in that ritual. Not simple murder, not simple theft, but binding, blood folding into blood, one body's nature reaching to claim another's, the family's oldest capacity for melding flesh together, turned in Mohg's hands into something closer to violence than communion, exactly the curdling we named all the way back at the start of tonight. Consider, too, what this ritual actually required of Miquella himself, the Golden Prince who has, until this exact moment in his own story, always been the one doing the severing, the one choosing what to cut away and what to preserve. Here, for perhaps the only time in his entire existence, the process runs in the opposite direction. He is not the one dividing. He is the material being divided, claimed, and repurposed by someone else's ambition, entirely bound against his own will into a ritual he did not design and would very likely never have consented to if consent had ever been on offer. Every other fracture tonight has walked through involved at least some measure of the person themselves shaping how the splitting actually happened, however costly the result. Miquella's captivity here breaks that pattern completely, and it is worth sitting with the discomfort of watching the family's most prolific architect of careful, deliberate division finally experience what it feels like from the other side of the knife. There's a smaller detail worth naming too, easy to overlook amid everything larger happening around it. The chamber where this ritual takes place carries its own atmosphere of devotion, blood-soaked and unsettling, dedicated to the formless Mother Mohg has adopted as his own private god, a figure this world offers almost no direct information about beyond the reverence Mohg himself extends toward her. Whatever she actually is, worshipped in secret beneath a capital that has no official record of her existing at all, she represents one more piece of evidence for everything this telling has been gathering, a buried tradition, entirely separate from the Golden Order's own sanctioned faith, still finding worshippers willing to build entire chambers and entire rituals around her, generations after the Golden Light was supposed to have replaced every older god this world once answered to. Before we return to where tonight began, there is one more brother worth meeting, because he took this family's oldest inheritance and did something with it none of his siblings ever attempted. Where every sibling so far has divided, he went looking for the opposite. Chapter 17: The Brother Who Went the Other Direction. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, shares Radagon's blood through Renala, rather than through Marika, born of that first marriage in Leornia, before Radagon was ever summoned back to Landel to become the second half of a divided god. He grows up watching his father vanish overnight, the same abandonment that shaped Radon and Rani, and he responds to it, in the end, more radically than either of his siblings ever did. He does not sever a piece of himself the way Miquella did. He does not scatter involuntarily the way his half-sister Malenia would. He goes looking for something enormous enough to disappear into entirely. That something is Fortisex, or more precisely the god-devouring serpent that eventually consumes the ancient dragon Fortisex, a creature whose entire nature is built around swallowing and absorbing power rather than dividing it. Rykard's path toward the devourer of gods, his final monstrous form, is not a splitting at all when you look closely at its actual shape. It is the inverse. Two beings, a man and a serpent, become one single body, Rykard's remaining withered human upper half barely visible atop the serpent's own coiled mass, a union rather than a division, fusion rather than fracture. Hold this up directly against everything else tonight has already traced, because the contrast matters more than it might first appear to. Every other sibling we have walked through tonight lost something in their own splitting, a piece cut away, a body scattered, a self reduced. Rykard, choosing fusion instead, does not simply avoid that particular cost. He pays an entirely different one. What remains of him at the end of his transformation is barely recognizable as the man he once was. His own voice, his own face, his own separate will, almost entirely swallowed by the vastly larger, considerably older hunger he chose to merge himself into. He escaped his family's habit of dividing into pieces by disappearing into something so much larger than himself that there was hardly enough of him left afterward to call a piece at all. There is a reading worth offering here carefully, because it deepens rather than contradicts everything tonight has already argued. If this family's oldest inheritance really is a shamanic capacity for flesh to meld harmoniously with other flesh, a capacity that curdles, generation after generation, into loss rather than communion, then Rykard's fusion with Fortisex may be the same underlying nature, expressed in the one direction none of his siblings ever tried. Not flesh dividing away from itself, but flesh reaching outward, melding with something monstrous and vastly larger, in search of a power his own single body could never otherwise have held. The result reads considerably less like communion, and considerably more like devouring, one more curdled version of a gift this family seems incapable of using gently, whichever direction they eventually decide to take it. We are almost back to where tonight began now, at the edge of a mystery involving a sword, a cave, and a creature the Golden Order tried hardest of all to make sure nobody ever noticed. Chapter 18: The Sword Left with a Stranger. Somewhere in a remote cave, sealed behind a locked stone door, far from anywhere the Golden Order's official history bothers to acknowledge, a great sword forged in the exact shape of the Elden Ring itself sits abandoned, held by a misbegotten, a creature this world's golden faith has spent generations treating as impure, unworthy, something to be quietly erased rather than explained. The weapon is plainly tied to Radagon's own authority, and its presence in the hands of exactly the kind of outcast figure. This family's faith spends its whole existence. Pushing to the margins deserves to be read against everything tonight has already shown you about how this bloodline treats the pieces of itself it cannot fully accept. A theory worth sitting with, offered carefully rather than as settled fact, suggests the misbegotten themselves may trace their origin back to Radagon directly, failed or discarded pieces of himself, cast off the same way Miquella cast off Trina, the same way this family seems to cast off, again and again, whatever parts of itself it decides it can no longer afford to keep. If that theory holds even partial weight, then the sword's location stops looking like a strange, isolated coincidence and starts looking like one more entry in a pattern this entire night has been slowly assembling. A god who cast off a piece of herself and called it Radagon. A son who cast off his own gentleness and called it Trina. A daughter whose violence scattered pieces of herself across a battlefield without her ever choosing it. A daughter who killed her own body outright rather than let this family's pattern claim it whole. A murdered prince whose death kept fracturing him into new faces for years afterward. Two brothers hidden whose own bodies may carry the family's oldest secret. And now, perhaps, an entire lineage of outcasts who may simply be more of Radagon's own discarded selves, wandering this world without any memory of where they actually came from. The weapon left with the misbegotten was never simply misplaced. If this reading holds, it was left exactly where every other discarded piece of this family eventually ends up, in the hands of someone the golden light decided it would rather not look at too closely. There is a second cave worth naming here too, easy to overlook, holding a second misbegotten and a second scrap of forgotten weaponry, far from the first, connected to it only by the same general shape of exile and concealment. Taken alone, either cave reads as a minor environmental detail, the kind of thing a completionist notices and everyone else walks past without a second thought. Taken together, alongside everything else this night has already gathered, they start to look less like isolated set dressing and more like a pattern this world buried on purpose, scattered widely enough that no single discovery ever forces the connection into view, waiting instead for someone willing to walk the whole map and notice how often the Golden family's discarded things end up exactly here, among exactly this kind of company. Consider, too, what it says about this family that their discarded weapons keep surfacing in the hands of creatures rather than simply rusting away untouched. A sword left in an empty room stays a sword, forgotten and inert. A sword picked up and carried by a misbegotten becomes something else entirely. A relationship, however unintended, between a piece of Radagon's own authority and an outcast his golden order spent generations refusing to acknowledge. Whether the misbegotten in question ever understands what they are actually holding, the pairing itself completes a kind of circuit. This family's entire history keeps quietly wiring together, cast off pieces of the golden bloodline finding their way, again and again, into the hands of exactly the people that bloodline's own faith taught everyone else to look away from. There is one final thought worth carrying forward from this cave before we move on. If the sword really did belong to Radagon, and if Radagon really was simply Marika wearing a second face, then this weapon is not merely a discarded object. It is a piece of the very god whose divided existence opened tonight's entire telling, resting now in a stranger's hands, in a locked room, guarded by a creature born of the exact same family, whose oldest secret this weapon quietly proves. The circle closes here more completely than it first appears to, long before we ever formally return to Radagon and Marika themselves in the chapters still ahead. Let that settle fully. We are ready now to walk back to where all of this genuinely began, and finally set every piece we have gathered tonight down side by side. Chapter 19, The First Split. Return now to Radagon and to Marika and to the confession this channel already walked through once, spoken plainly by a defeated queen in a flooded academy. Radagon is Marika, was all along, two names, two faces, two entire lives lived in parallel for years, one single divided being underneath both crowns the entire time. Hold that confession up now against everything tonight has actually shown you, because it no longer stands alone the way it once seemed to. Marika did not invent the pattern this family keeps repeating. She may simply have been its first fully documented instance, the moment this bloodline's oldest tendency, that same shamanic capacity for flesh to meld and divide that predates the Golden Order entirely, finally became visible enough for a defeated queen to name it out loud. Every child born after her, golden or omen, favored or hidden, appears to have inherited some version of the exact same fracture, expressed differently depending on who they were and what pressures they were actually under. But recognizably, unmistakably, the same wound passed down through blood that has never once, across an entire recorded family history, managed to stay simply, singularly, one person. Consider the full shape of it now, gathered together rather than scattered across separate mysteries. Marika became two people to survive the demands of being both an Empyrean and immortal champion at once, drawing on an inheritance older than the faith she founded. Miquella cut away his own gentleness to survive the demands of becoming ruthless enough for godhood, preserving what he lost with obvious care. Malenia's violence scattered pieces of herself across a battlefield she could not otherwise have survived, an involuntary echo of her mother's deliberate choice. Rani looked at the whole pattern clearly enough to destroy her own body rather than let it be claimed the way her father's and her half-siblings' bodies kept being claimed. Godwin's murder fractured him into new faces across two continents, over and over, for years after his actual death, proof that this capacity does not need anyone's consent to activate. Mohg and Morgott may carry, hidden inside an inherited curse, the oldest and least golden piece of this family's actual nature, still faintly alive underneath everything the golden performance tried to bury. Morgott disciplined enough to turn that division into a working second identity he wears as easily as a second name. Rykard, inheriting the same restless nature through a different marriage entirely, took it in the one direction none of his siblings tried, fusing himself into something vastly larger, rather than dividing himself into something smaller, and lost nearly as much of himself in the merging as any of them ever lost in the splitting. And scattered across this world's forgotten corners, an entire lineage of outcasts may simply be more of Radagon's own discarded selves, wandering without any memory of where they came from. None of them chose this inheritance. All of them received it anyway, the way any family passes down the shape of its deepest wound to children who never asked for it and rarely understand, until far too late, what they are actually carrying, or where it first came from, back before there was ever a golden order at all to hide it inside of. Let that fill the room for a moment before we look at two more pieces of this world worth carrying into the closing, something considerably stranger than a family trait and considerably older. There is a rival power worth meeting first, because it answers tonight's central question in the opposite direction from everything you have already seen. Chapter 20. The Flame That Erases Rather Than Divides. Somewhere beneath the round table, Hold's own golden sanctuary, kept apart from the two fingers, this telling is about to properly introduce, three considerably darker fingers wait in their own separate chamber, servants of the frenzied flame, an outer power directly opposed to everything the greater will and its golden intermediaries claim to represent. Where the two fingers guide tarnished toward becoming an Elden Lord, singular and legitimate, the three fingers offer something else entirely, madness, total and consuming. A fire that does not divide a person into manageable, separate pieces the way this entire night has already traced. It erases the boundary between one person and everyone else instead, burning away the very distinction that made them separate individuals to begin with. This distinction deserves real weight because it offers the clearest possible contrast to everything tonight has already gathered. Marika's family keeps producing fractures that preserve some version of individual identity, even while dividing it. Radagon still recognizably himself, even while also being Marika. Miquella's severed gentleness, still recognizably gentle, even while separated from him. Millicent still uncertain, but still undeniably a specific person with her own name and her own choices. The frenzied flame offers no such preservation. Its version of losing the boundary between self and other does not produce two distinct fragments, each carrying forward some piece of the whole. It produces total consumption, an ever expanding fire that wants eventually to burn away every last trace of individual selfhood across this entire world until nothing remains separate enough to even be called a fragment anymore. Consider what this suggests about the actual range of options this world offers anyone struggling under demands their own single self cannot bear. Marika's bloodline chose division again and again in every register, from Radagon's careful doubling to Rykard's total surrender into something larger. The frenzied flame offers the opposite extreme entirely: erasure rather than division, madness rather than multiplication, an ending to the burden of selfhood that does not preserve any piece of what it consumes. Between those two poles, division that at least tries to keep something of the original intact, and erasure that keeps nothing at all, this family's entire long, tangled history reads as a series of increasingly desperate attempts to find some sustainable middle position, and the evidence gathered across this entire telling suggests they never quite managed to find one. There is a detail worth naming before we move past this, because it reaches back to the very beginning of tonight's telling. If the capacity for flesh to divide and meld really does trace back to something shamanic, something older than the Golden Order, then the frenzied flame's own total erasure may represent an even older, even more fundamental force, one that predates the shamanic tradition itself, an outer power this world's entire structure of Golden Order, buried shamanism, and everything in between was perhaps always quietly built to hold back. Division on this reading is not simply this family's curse. It may be the only defense a self has ever had against the far worse alternative waiting underneath it, the total consuming erasure that never bothers to leave anything behind at all. Rest here a moment. Before we meet the Golden Hands, considerably gentler in comparison, there is one more woman worth visiting, someone who has made a quiet, private practice out of gathering pieces of the dead long before any of tonight's larger mysteries ever gave that practice a name. Chapter 21: The Woman Who Collects the Unfinished. Fia, deathbed companion, waits in the Round Table Hold's own lower chambers, offering something no other figure in this sanctuary quite dares to offer: a warm embrace to anyone willing to accept it, meant to ease a dying tarnished's passing with something gentler than the cold, ordinary mechanics of grace and resurrection this world otherwise relies on. That embrace, however, is not simply comfort. It carries its own quiet cost, and Fia's true ambition, once you dig past the tenderness she performs so convincingly, involves claiming the very position of lord for herself, raised not through conquest or golden legitimacy, but through a private, considerably stranger kind of assembly. She keeps champions, gathered and raised from among the dead, spirits bound to her own purposes, the way so much else in this world's oldest traditions has already taught you to recognize by now. One of them, a knight known simply as D, exists now as a kind of divided being himself, his own brother having taken up his identity and his duties after death claimed the original, two men sharing one name and one role across a boundary that should have been final and clean. Whatever Fia's embrace actually does to the people who accept it, it does not appear to end things as cleanly as death is supposed to. It gathers, repurposes, and reassembles, quietly, patiently, the same shape this entire telling keeps finding everywhere it looks. Consider what her own private ambition suggests about how widely this family's central wound has actually spread by this point in the story. Fia is no relation to Marika's bloodline at all, so far as this world's surviving evidence ever confirms. She is simply a woman who found her own path toward power by learning independently the same basic lesson this golden family already knew, that a whole, singular self dying cleanly is far less useful and far less powerful than a self divided, gathered, and reassembled into something new. Whether she learned this from watching the Golden family's own long history or arrived at it entirely on her own, her existence suggests this wound was never quite as contained to one bloodline as the earlier hours of tonight's telling might have implied. It was always, perhaps, simply waiting to be discovered by anyone patient enough and hungry enough to go looking for it. Rest here a moment before we meet the Golden Hands, considerably gentler in comparison, waiting in their own separate chamber close by. Chapter 22. The Hands That Are Also a Person, inside the Round Table. Hold, so sanctuary for tarnished returned from exile. A chest of golden fingers rests behind glass, tended, guarded, and spoken of by everyone nearby, with a hushed reverence usually reserved for gods rather than objects. These are the two fingers, intermediaries of the greater will, the outside power that first chose Marika as its vessel and that continues, throughout this entire story, to select who among the tarnished gets to walk the path toward becoming the next Elden Lord. Most players accept the two fingers as simply another piece of this world's strange, this sacred furniture, golden hands that whisper guidance and grant favor, never questioning what they actually are or where they actually came from. But listen closely to Anastasia, tarnished eater of death, a woman who has consumed the flesh of failed, forgotten tarnished for longer than anyone else still walking this world, and a considerably stranger implication starts to surface. Her own dialogue suggests, carefully, elliptically, the way this world tends to suggest its darkest truths, that the fingers themselves may be grown, quite literally, from pieces of the chosen tarnished, whose flesh she has consumed and repurposed over the centuries. If that reading holds even partial weight, then the very hands guiding your entire journey through this world, the golden fingers every player trusts and follows without a second thought, are themselves another instance of tonight's central pattern. A person's flesh divided, repurposed, and set loose to serve a function considerably larger than the individual it was taken from. Not Marika's bloodline this time. Something older, something belonging to the greater will directly, using the exact same underlying method Marika's own family would later inherit and enact on itself, generation after generation, whether any of them ever understood where the capacity originally came from. This widens everything tonight has already shown you in a way worth sitting with before we finally close. The Wake Me wound may never have started with Marika at all. It may be, at its very root, simply how the greater will interacts with this entire world, dividing, repurposing, and reassembling flesh wherever it needs a new function performed, and Marika's own splitting into Radagon and herself may simply be the largest, most visible instance of a method the greater will was already practicing on ordinary, forgotten tarnished, long before she ever arrived to inherit it for her own considerably grander purposes. The family you have spent tonight walking through did not invent this wound. They may simply be the clearest mirror this world ever built of a much older, much larger hunger, one that reaches all the way down to golden hands, resting quietly in a glass case, waiting for the next stranger foolish or desperate enough to reach inside. Let that fill the room for a moment before we close. There is one more place the same wound hides, closer to your own hands than anything else tonight has shown you, worth naming before we finally set everything down. Chapter 23. Everyone else's small, borrowed deaths. Every tarnished who has ever summoned a spirit ash into battle has already, without necessarily realizing it, been practicing tonight's central pattern themselves hundreds of times over on beings considerably smaller and considerably less famous than anyone this telling has spent real time with. A spirit ash is not simply a convenient combat tool. It is what remains of someone or something that once lived a full and complete existence, reduced now to a fragment small enough to be summoned, spent, and dismissed over and over in service of a battle that was never its own to fight in the first place. Consider what this actually means once you have already spent tonight learning to notice this pattern everywhere it hides. Golden Order soldiers, ordinary wolves, even fellow tarnished who died somewhere along their own separate journeys, all end up reduced to the same basic shape, a piece of themselves, cut away from whatever whole life they once lived, carried in a jar or a bell, and called back into existence only when someone else needs a body to stand between them and death for a few brief minutes. That is not simply a gameplay convenience dressed up in flavor text. It is, held up against everything tonight has already traced, one more version of the exact same wound, practiced so casually, so constantly by so many players who never once think to ask where these small, borrowed lives actually came from, that it has become nearly invisible simply through sheer repetition. There is a difference worth naming, though, between this version of the wound and every other version tonight has already walked through. Marika, Miquella, Malenia, Godwin, Mohg, and Morgott. All of them were people first, whole and named and remembered before the splitting ever happened to them. Most spirit ashes carry no such dignity. They are simply used again and again by strangers who never learn their names, spent as casually as a consumable item rather than mourned as a fragment of someone who once had an entire life outside the jar, now holding what remains of them. If this world's oldest families curdled a once gracious capacity for melding flesh into something that mostly means loss, the spirit ash system suggests that curdling did not stop with the golden bloodline at all. It spread outward, eventually, into the basic mechanics ordinary people use to survive an ordinary Tuesday in this world, until splitting a life into a spendable fragment stopped reading as tragedy entirely, and simply became one more tool sitting in your own inventory, waiting to be summoned. There is a smaller mercy hiding inside a handful of these fragments, worth naming before we move on, because not every spirit ash reads as pure tragedy. Some carry real personality forward into their reduced, summonable state, distinct voices, distinct behaviors, small flashes of the whole life that once surrounded them. That mercy does not undo what happened to them, but it does suggest that even a life reduced this far down, this thoroughly, does not always lose absolutely everything in the reduction. Something of who they were sometimes survives the cut, the same faint hope carried by every larger, more famous fracture this telling has already walked through tonight. Let that fill the room for a moment before we close. There is one final thing worth saying quietly before you let yourself finish drifting. Chapter 24, What Every Split Self Was Actually For. Every fracture tonight has walked through shares one final thing in common, easy to miss if you have been following the mysteries individually rather than gathered together like this. None of them, not one single instance across this entire family's recorded history, actually solved the problem it was meant to solve. Marika's splitting delayed her reckoning with the Golden Order's cost, but did not prevent it, and the shattering eventually arrived anyway. Miquella's splitting let him become ruthless enough to pursue godhood, but the compassion he preserved so tenderly in that fissure never returned to soften what his ambition eventually cost the people bound to him. Malenia's scattered pieces gave her something like survival, but left her siblings uncertain, homeless, unable to fully belong anywhere. Rani's destroyed body bought her distance from the family's fate, but never fully freed her from repeating some smaller, quieter version of the very pattern she was trying to escape. Godwin's fracturing never granted him the clean death his own nature was supposed to guarantee him. Mohg's stolen ritual, built on his own buried older blood, ended in violence and failure rather than the new dynasty he was reaching for. Rykard's fusion won him monstrous power and cost him nearly everything recognizable about the man he used to be, proof that even reversing the family's pattern entirely still ends in the same kind of loss. Splitting yourself apart, this family's entire history seems to argue, has never actually been a solution to anything. It has only ever been a postponement, a way of surviving one more day, one more war, one more impossible demand, at the direct cost of leaving some piece of yourself behind, unresolved, uncared for, waiting in the dark for someone who usually never comes back. Consider, too, everyone this pattern eventually reached who was never actually part of this golden bloodline at all. Renala, absorbing some fraction of this same wound simply through marriage and proximity, her grief scattering into masked fragments long before she ever fully understood why. Malenia, purpose-built, or perhaps simply born into a role that never let her exist as anything else. Fia, gathering champions from among the dead entirely independent of any golden inheritance, learning the same lesson this family knew from somewhere else entirely. The golden fingers themselves, grown, if the theory holds, from ordinary tarnish this world never bothered to remember by name. And every player who has ever summoned a fragment of some forgotten life into battle without a second thought, carrying this exact pattern forward, casually, constantly, without ever suspecting they were practicing anything at all. Whatever this family started, or perhaps merely inherited from something older than themselves, it did not stay contained to their own bloodline for very long. It spread outward into marriages, into intermediaries, into the basic mechanics ordinary strangers used to survive, until the entire lands between became, in its own quiet way, one more body this same old wound had learned how to divide. Consider, finally, what tonight's entire investigation actually rested on to even become possible. A single word, Wakemi, easy to miss, easy to walk past in a translation most players never think to double-check against the original. Everything this telling has gathered, the sleeping sister, the uncertain swordswoman, the scattered prince, the two brothers, the serpent, the destroyed body, the woman who gathers the dead, all of it was always there, in the text, available to anyone patient enough to notice the pattern repeating. This world does not hide its deepest wounds behind locked doors or impossible puzzles. It simply trusts that most people, moving quickly through a story this large, will never slow down enough to notice the same word and the same shape, quietly repeating itself in every corner they pass through. Tonight, you slowed down enough. That is the only difference between walking past this family's wound 100 times without seeing it, and finally, quietly, understanding exactly what you were always looking at. Perhaps that is the quietest, truest thing this entire bloodline ever teaches you, whether any of them ever meant to teach it at all. A person, or a god, or whatever this family actually is underneath its golden performance, can survive being divided for a very long time. But survival was never the same thing as healing, and nothing in this world's entire recorded history suggests this family, or the world they eventually reshaped in their own broken image, ever learned the difference, generation after generation, piece after abandoned piece, all the way back to whatever older, shamanic flesh first learned that dividing was a way to keep living, and never quite learned how to stop. There is a final image worth carrying with you as you finally let go of tonight's entire telling, gathered from everything already gathered. Picture every fragment that this family ever produced, every severed piece, every scattered rune, every borrowed name, every quiet sleeper laid out together at last, side by side, in a single room built specifically to hold all of them at once. Not reassembled, because that was never actually possible, not for any of them, not even for Marika herself, simply gathered finally, close enough together that none of them have to keep waiting alone in the dark for a return that was never going to come. Let your own body stay whole a while longer than theirs ever managed to. There's nothing left to solve tonight, only the shape of every scattered piece, finally gathered, finally allowed to rest in the same quiet room together, at least for as long as you need them to.